So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here. My name is Alicia Michelli and I'm coming at you from Talking Leaves Bookstore in Buffalo, New York. We are Buffalo's oldest independent bookstore and we are absolutely thrilled to bring you a very exciting conversation tonight. We are welcoming back our dear friend from just over the border in Toronto, Jessica Vitalis, who will be celebrating the launch today of her brand new book, Coyote Queen. Jessica is a Columbia MBA wielding writer and presenter whose work has been translated into 3 languages. She's published The Wolf's Curse and a standalone companion novel, The Rabbit's Gift, which received a School Library Journal starred review and was named a Canadian Children's Book Center's best book for kids and teens in 2023. Coyote Queen, as I said, launches today and has already received the Kirkus starred review and is a Junior Library Guild Gold Standard selection. Very excited. We also we're welcoming Chrystal Giles, who is a champion for diversity and representation in children's literature. Chrystal made her debut with Take Back the Block, which received multiple starred reviews, was Kirkus Reviews, School Library Journal, and an NPR Best Book. Her latest middle grade novel, Not an Easy Win, which has already received multiple starred reviews, is available now. And Chrystal lives outside Charlotte, North Carolina, with her son, Chrystal. And today's conversation will be moderated by Pat Zietlow Miller. Hi, Pat. Pat has published 20 picture books. Whoa, with more on the way. Her first book, which I know many of you know, Sophie's Squash, won the Golden Kite Award, an Ezra Jack Keats New Writer Honor, and a Charlotte Zollico Honor. Be Kind was on the New York Times bestseller list for 10 weeks, and In Our Garden was a Dolly Parton Imagination Library selection. Pat lives in Wisconsin. Welcome, everybody. And we have Pat's latest picture book here. Beautiful. We're so happy to have you here. And so we are going to launch this conversation. Please feel free to drop any questions that you may have in the chat. I'm also going to put links to all of our visiting authors' books in the chat so you can take a look if you're interested in checking out any of their other work. I would also like to mention that we were hoping to have another author with us tonight, Rhonda Rumani. And unfortunately, sadly, Rhonda's mother passed away, and we are unable to have her with us tonight. But we are sending her our wishes and condolences. And I will also be including her books in the chat as well. So you can take a look at her work. And so I'm going to hand this over to Pat. Pat, take it away. We're looking forward to the conversation.
Okay, well, great. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. And thanks to Talking Leaves for hosting us. We're going to be talking about middle grade books with heart. And both Jessica and Chrystal have written beautiful middle grade books with heart. Jessica's Coyote Queen came out today from Green Willow. And Chrystal's Not an Easy Win came out recently from Random House. And when I talk about books with heart, what I'm talking about is books that have a universal emotion so that any reader, no matter their age, their gender, their cultural background, their life experiences, can read the book and have that moment where they go, oh, I felt like that. Heart is what makes you keep thinking about the book long after you've turned the last page. It's what makes you want to come back and read a book again and again and again. And so we're going to talk to Jessica and Chrystal about their books and how they've added heart into their wonderful stories. And so I want to start with each of you sharing a little bit about your book and maybe even reading just a little bit of it for each of us so we kind of know what we're going to be talking about going forward. And since it's your book birthday, Jessica, do you want to start off?
I would love to. Thank you so much. First of all, thank you to Alicia and Talking Leaves for hosting us tonight. Crystal, thanks for joining me. And Pat, thank you for moderating. Pat and I have a kind of fun connection in that we both lived across the street from each other many, many, many years ago when we were starting out writing. And Pat's career really took off with her beautiful picture books. And I went into middle grade, but we've stayed in touch. And her books just have such tremendous heart that when we were tossing around the idea for this panel, I just knew she would be a great moderator. So I'm delighted to have everybody here tonight. And I can't wait to talk about Coyote Queen. It is the story of my heart. It came out today. This is a story about a 12-year-old girl named Fudd. And Fudd lives in this isolated trailer in rural Wyoming with her mother and her mother's abusive boyfriend. And Fudd is really desperate to escape this situation, especially when the boyfriend, whose name is Larry, brings home a giant rusted out boat that he plans to fix up, and he plans to turn it into their permanent home. So Fudd decides to enter a local beauty pageant, hoping that she might win the prize money that she and her mother need to escape. But she develops an eerie connection to a local pack of coyotes, and she starts to experience strange changes to her body. She gets a better sense of smell, she goes colorblind, and eventually she has to figure out how she is going to win a beauty pageant, even though she has grown a tail. So that is a little bit about the story. I would love to read to you. I think I'm going to read just a few paragraphs from kind of the middle of the opening chapter that I think does a nice job of introducing Fudd and kind of her situation. First, I have to put on my granny glasses, as my kids like to call them. So they never pass up an opportunity to remind me that I'm old. Okay. As I moved toward and back around the lumpy couch and the worn recliner no one but Larry was allowed to sit in, I smelled the chocolate cake baking in the oven. Larry would be home from work soon. He claimed he didn't eat sweets on account of his training to get back in the ring. Apparently the empty ho-ho packages I saw in the trash every morning didn't count. But it was his birthday, so Mom had splurged on groceries and made him an all-natural cake out of carob and honey. I didn't know why you'd eat chocolate cake of any kind if you cared about being healthy, but whatever. I couldn't wait to see the look on his face when she brought it out, and I really couldn't wait to have a piece. Even though this wasn't one of the fancy store-bought cakes that I'd always longed to try, you really couldn't go wrong when it came to chocolate cake. With a little luck, Larry would be in a good mood. "You're the ref in my ring," he'd say to Mom, breaking into a real grin, and not the kind he gave when he thought someone was an idiot and he was about to make sure they knew it. Then he'd say a bunch of other goofy things like, "You're the tape on my knuckles," and "You're the gloves on my fists." And Mom would giggle and raise her hand up to cover the snaggled front tooth she'd never had the money to fix. And then they'd kiss, which would be gross. But he'd be happy and tell us stories from when he was the middleweight boxing champion of Wyoming and Nebraska. I loved his stories, even though I was never quite sure if they were true. I searched online once. I couldn't find a single article about him biting someone's ear off in the ring, although there was an article about another boxer who did that. He'd sit for hours drinking his Bud Light and spinning yarns about all the men he'd whooped. Sometimes Mom let me stay up late and listen. Other times, usually when he got to a story about how he kicked someone's can outside the ring, she told me it was time to shower, even if I'd showered the night before. She was just trying to get rid of me because she didn't think fighting was the answer to all the world's problems, but she didn't dare say that in front of Larry, or she'd end up in a fight herself.
Excellent. Wow. Okay. And Crystal?
Yes, so wow. I read Jessica's story really earlier this year, and I love it so much. And I'm so honored to be here on your book birthday to talk about books with heart. So I'm Crystal. My latest book is Not an Easy Win. It published earlier this year. It is about 12-year-old Lawrence. He's going through a bit of a rough time. Lawrence has been expelled from school. That happens in the very first chapter. He has moved to a very small town with his grandmother and his mom and his little sister, and he's not fitting in. Nothing about this small town really has welcomed him. And then he gets expelled from school. And he keeps telling people it's not his fault. He's not fitting in. People are picking on him, but he never really feels like people are listening to him. So he eventually finds a rec center where he's kind of working, kind of there to learn and fill his days. Ultimately, he finds chess the game that lots of kids play there. And so it is an open door for him to find a mentor and some friends. And eventually he learns how to tell his own story and not be trapped in the history of some of the things that have happened to him. So I will read a very small portion of the first chapter. The first chapter of this book is the hardest. It is when Lawrence is expelled. And I kind of purposely started the book here in a way to pull the reader in. So I'll read a very short portion of the end of the first chapter. This is after Lawrence is expelled. His mom is picking him up from school. Needless to say, she's not happy with him. And so he's a little bit stuck on what to do. Look, Lawrence, this ain't all your fault. Life is hard, and we've had a double dose of hard lately. Mom's voice was softer now, her version of an apology. I knew I'd never get the real thing. Ma wasn't the apologizing type. Whenever I did something wrong, I had to apologize. I wasn't sure why adults didn't have to. For a moment, I'd forgotten about my stinking left eye. It would double in size if I didn't get ice on it soon. I sat in the thick of Mom's car, waiting for her to ask about it, or at least ask if I was okay. 2 long minutes passed. Silence. All right, let's just go in and get it over with. Ma sighed. If she said something, we'll just say it wasn't your fault. It wasn't my fault, I wanted to yell out, but I knew it wouldn't matter. No one cared about what had really happened. No one cared that I had a huge target on me since the day I started at that school. Everyone just looked at me like I was the problem.
All right. And I read Crystal's book on a plane flight, and it was so engrossed. I got it done before we landed. And so I was very happy to read that book. One of the things when I was reading both of your books, and we'll talk about this a lot, is there was a lot of like overlap in terms of themes and just things that I thought were great that you both approached in different ways. And in your author's notes for the book, you each mentioned that some personal events in your life growing up kind of found their way into the stories that you wrote. So could you talk a little bit about that? And I don't know, Crystal, do you want to go first?
Okay, yes. I started out with this book not thinking about myself at all. I thought that I would write this book about a young boy who was perceived in a way that wasn't always positive, and some of those negative perceptions he started to internalize. And so I thought I would write a story about a boy struggling with his current situation, but being empowered to tell his own story. What I did not realize is that I started to write bits and pieces of my own childhood into the story. At times throughout the story, Lawrence is living in kind of an intergenerational home. He's moved in with his granny. Throughout my life, that was also a reality. I was often kind of ashamed and embarrassed that I did not have the family that I perceived everyone else to have. And so at different times throughout my life, me and my mom and my siblings would move in with my grandmother. And I always felt a little bit ashamed about that. Lawrence also has a parent, his father is incarcerated, and he feels also ashamed and embarrassed about that. No one talks about it. It's almost like the reality that no one wants to really have conversations around. And that's something else that was also my reality. I had a father that was often absent, often incarcerated, and no one talked about it. And so I, in that way, felt totally alone and isolated from other people. And so since no one talked about it, I didn't talk about it either. But I did think in this story, I had a unique viewpoint on how many young people are dealing with incarcerated parents. We talk a lot about mass incarceration, but we don't talk enough about the young people who are experiencing that. And so when I developed this character, I ended up writing those bits of my own reality into the story. And eventually, I think it made the story stronger because I had a personal viewpoint. But those are some of the large components of the story that I kind of inadvertently wrote into it, and then eventually decided that they were a good place to keep the story.
And do you play chess?
I know how to play chess. I am not very good at it. I will be totally honest and say that. I did a ton of research for the book, but I lose often.
Awesome. Okay, and Jessica?
All right. So my personal ties to this book. Let's see. I had a very unusual childhood. So I ended up moving almost 24 times before I reached fourth grade. And we lived in a one-room cabin with no electricity and running water. And we lived in a school bus. And at one point we lived in a camper that we pulled behind our car. And during that portion of my childhood, I was cold a lot and I was hungry a lot. And I was also scared a lot because one of the adults in my life didn't really treat me in the way that adults should treat children. And I learned that it was a lot safer to be invisible. And that was a real problem because I was not good at being invisible. And I had this very deep-seated longing to be seen and to be heard. And this longing really carried with me into adulthood. And so I decided that I was going to write a memoir to talk about my childhood and make sure my story was told. And I tried to do that various times and in various ways throughout many, 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 many years in my life. And I learned that writing a memoir is really, really difficult because number one, life doesn't follow a really neat narrative arc. But the other thing is that I really didn't have the writing chops to pull off writing a novel, much less a memoir. So I ended up setting it aside and writing a lot of fiction. And it really wasn't until I started to realize that it wasn't telling my story that it was important, that it was really that I wanted to shine a light on kids who are still stuck living in really difficult situations. And that gave me the idea to just pluck a few threads from my story and fictionalize the rest. And once I did that, the story really came to life.
And what made you decide to include coyotes as an element? Why did you pick that particular animal?
Oh, that's an interesting one. So one of the things that is a very salient memory for me in my childhood, when we lived in that cabin that I mentioned, it was out in the middle of nowhere on the South Dakota-Wyoming border. And in order to get to the bathroom, we had this sort of primitive outhouse that was quite a distance across an open field. And it was a piece of wood set between two rocks with a hole in the middle, just outdoors. And there were a couple of problems with that. One, it was Wyoming and the rattlesnakes really like to sun themselves on the rocks. So that made going to the bathroom really, really challenging. But the other thing was that at night, the coyotes would be howling around my cabin. And so I would be terrified to leave the cabin because I didn't know then what I know now, which is that coyotes have this remarkable ability to make themselves sound like one or two coyotes is a giant pack. So even though they were probably just one or two coyotes miles away, I was convinced that they were circling us, waiting to eat poor little 10-year-old Jessica. And so as I was writing this book, that memory of the coyotes kept coming back to me over and over and over. And I realized that I could really use a connection with the coyotes, and particularly Fudd's connection with the coyotes, as a metaphor for her longing to escape. And so that's where the little twist of magic ended up coming into the story.
Oh, I love that. I mean, I don't love the rattlesnake coyote experience, but it's an amazing story.
Yeah.
So both of you, as you were writing your books, were remembering things that, weren't maybe the happiest parts of your childhood. So how did you figure out, what to share and what not to share? And then how did you handle any memories that might have bubbled up, or feelings about those memories as you were, revisiting those times in your life?
Go ahead.
I guess I will jump in. I will tell you that therapy is a powerful tool. As I prepared to share the story, so often when you're drafting, there's a connection, and then when you revise, there's an even deeper connection. I write in first person, which means I am right in the head of my character. And as I started to get closer and closer to him, I started to have all of these feelings of, oh no, I'm going to have to release this book. And releasing the book is not just it publishing. Releasing the book is this act in where you say the book no longer belongs to me, it belongs to the public. That comes with criticism, that comes with likes and dislikes, it comes with being on panels, talking about it. And I was not ready for that. I did not think that it would become a problem, but it was. So I talked to a therapist about how to do that. I worked between the months that it took from finishing revision to publish dates to get ready to have conversations. And I'm so glad I did. It brought back memories of times where I did not know I was a poor child, but I was. All of these things started to bubble up. And then I realized that I wanted to tell the story and it was important, but I had to myself get ready for the releasing of it.
No, definitely true.
That's really interesting, Crystal. I think I had almost the opposite experience in that it should have been really difficult to write down and dig into these, darker moments and memories and traumas. But sometimes what happens when you experience traumas, you go through a process called disassociation. It's a sort of survival mechanism. And I got really good at that as a kid, where I could just go into my head and live in this really safe, happy space. And that sort of overflowed into my day-to-day life, where I got really good at building this giant wall between what I was actually experiencing and my emotions. And that was great. That served me really, really well as a kid. It was a terrific survival mechanism. Not so great when you're trying to write a book, because it took me a long time to learn that readers don't actually really care very much about plot. They certainly don't want to read about trauma after trauma after trauma. What readers really care about is characters, and more specifically, they care about characters' reactions to things. And I didn't have any emotional access to any of that. And so I wrote this early draft of my memoir, which we were just talking before the show, Pat unfortunately had to suffer through. And I showed it to another friend who's watching tonight. I asked her to read it and give me feedback. And she sat me down and said, there's a lot of really tough stuff in here, but oddly enough, I don't really feel anything while I'm reading it. And I remember being really stunned at the time. Like, how can you read this terrible stuff and not feel anything? And so I had to go through my own healing process. And like Crystal said, a lot of therapy in order to access my own emotions. And then even at that, it still really took giving Fudd her own character and her own life that I could have that degree of separation where I felt safe enough to sort of draw upon my experience and my emotions. And at that point, it really just became a matter of telling her story and doing justice to her emotions. So it was a really long process for me that started with absolutely no emotional attachment at all.
Right. Okay. So, and this might be an obvious question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. What do you think are the benefits of writing stories that show characters who are struggling and trying and sometimes failing and sometimes succeeding? What's the benefit of doing that?
That's a great question. I think in this day and age, it's really easy for us all to curate our lives, especially because so many of our connections are on social platforms, and we're all really good at making it seem like our lives are perfect. And in reality, that doesn't leave room for the humanity and the messy and the darker sides of life that we're all experiencing. So I think books are a really important way to show kids that we're all going through things and that it's okay to mess up and that there's hope and that there's recovery. And I just think it's really important for them to see those type of role models that maybe they aren't so much getting in real life.
Yeah.
I don't know, Crystal.
I love that. I would absolutely echo everything that Jessica said. I think it's important that we put real kids on the page. That's one of the things that I always make sure I repeat to myself, putting real kids, real situations on the page.
Crystal, you are so good at that. I just want to say, like, for anybody who hasn't read Crystal's books, her characters come across as so authentic that you just feel like you know them and you want to like grab them and squeeze them in a big hug.
Yes.
I love that. And so that's one of the things I really try to focus on. I think another real benefit to putting stories that include struggle and stumbles is so that we also create empathy for other readers. So not every situation you read in a book you will relate directly to. That's totally fine. What we try to do, particularly for young readers, is create empathy so that even if you've not had an experience with domestic violence or poverty, or you may not have an incarcerated parent, but you know what that story is and how a kid feels. And so if you have a friend or a neighbor or a classmate, you may have a little peek into their life. And so maybe when you hear about a story that you can't relate to, you go, oh, I read this book. And so I know what that feels like. And so if we can start creating empathy when the kids are 10 and 11, we're ahead of the game. So that's another reason I think it's important.
No, I completely agree. I always think that, books show us a wider view of the world. We all know our own little corner, the life we've lived, but, we're often kind of clueless about the lives of other people around us. And books are just such a great way to see all the different ways that there are to be. So I love that.
I just want to jump in and say, Rhonda couldn't be here tonight, but I was thinking about that so much as I was reading the early arc of her book. It's about a refugee who has to come to the US. And I did wonder at first, is this going to be relatable? And it just pulled me in, and I felt for this kid so deeply by the end of the book. She just did an absolutely brilliant job. So if you have a chance to read it when it comes out, I highly recommend it.
Okay, so Fudd and Lawrence, your two main characters, are really wonderful characters that you can't help but root for. But I want to talk a little bit about the antagonists in the book. Both Fudd and Lawrence have characters that aren't really all that nice to them throughout the course of the book. But then as the book goes on, they learn a little bit more about those characters' lives and develop maybe just a little bit more empathy for what they might be struggling with. So I want to talk about Ava in your book, Jessica, and Deuce in your book, Crystal. If you could just tell us a little bit about who they are, how they kind of offset your main character, and why you created them the way you did.
Sure. So I'll start there. So Deuce is a boy who also is at the rec center. His father actually is one of the operators and owners of the rec center. And so Lawrence enters this place. He's feeling alone. He's feeling kind of left out. And he meets a friend, and then he also meets Deuce. And so Deuce is instantly turned off by him. He's not very nice, and he and Lawrence kind of have a bit of a battle. We love to have our characters kind of just go through life and everything's perfect, but that's not reality. So I had to put a bit of a mean kid in Lawrence's way. And he's also ended up being a mirror for Lawrence to see. This is what I look like when I'm upset. This is what I look like when I haven't dealt with some of the internal things. I will tell you there's great news. They start off as enemies. They end up as friends. I won't tell you how that happens, but I thought it was really important to see the journey of how kids can relate to one another. They find out they have a lot in common, actually, that their lives have a lot of similarities. And ultimately, he learns how to be a friend. I think early in the story, he doesn't even know that he can be a friend. He's not really quite sure what qualities he has to share. And so eventually he gets to do that. I love having layered characters. I knew that Deuce couldn't just be this flat mean kid. I knew I had to give him full roundness. And I think they end up kind of coming together in a beautiful way in the story.
Yeah, I really liked how you didn't make it easy for them to become friends. I mean, Lawrence really had to kind of work for it because Deuce was not receptive. But then it all came around, but it was very, very true to life. And Ava is a similar story, although she and Fudd don't quite end up being friends by the end of the book.
That's right. So Ava is Fudd's bully, and I was very worried about her coming across as just this stock, stereotypical, evil sort of character. And I think it was important to have her in the story because I did need a contrast. Fudd has this tendency to romanticize anybody who has money. And I think when you grow up in poverty, that's very easy to do. You look at people who have any amount of money or resources and you think that their life is perfect. So that was a really important part of the story. But at the same time, we all know that nobody's lives are perfect. And again, it goes back to the idea of how we curate our images. And so I really wanted to show the readers that even though she does have a lot of privilege and a lot of advantage, she's also dealing with some pretty tough stuff. And that doesn't excuse her behavior, but it helps make her feel like more of a rounded character. And I just want to say, I really try to do the same thing with Larry too, because when you're dealing with somebody who is an abuser, I don't think anybody is just stock evil. And there isn't any excuse for the stuff that Larry does. But at the same time, it's going back to that Larry. And I really wanted to show that he has his own set of dreams and his own set of emotional wounds and doesn't excuse why he does, but it just helps the reader see him as a more whole person and a more layered character.
Yeah, I really want to say this about Ava. I was so hoping that she would be better. I kept waiting for the moment that she would turn good. And I mean, they did not become best friends or anything, but I was hoping that we would get a little bit more. So I love the way that you gave her a little something because she was getting on my nerves, and I just needed her. I just needed her to have something positive. So you did a great job with her.
So, yeah, they're not friends, but there's that increased level of understanding at the end on Fud's part that like, oh, okay, I can see why maybe she's the way she is.
Yeah, there's a little humanity there.
Yeah. I want to talk about parents too. You've mentioned, Larry and sort of that step parent role. Both Fudd and Lawrence have one parent, one absentee parent, and the parent that's on hand loves their kid and is trying, but is also struggling and doesn't always, get it right or provide the support or the understanding that the characters might need. So how did you approach that? How did you balance the love versus the sometimes bit of neglect? I mean, how did you make that work?
That was a struggle for me because I was really worried about writing, again, just a stereotypical character. I think it's really easy to fall into the trope of, oh, they're poor, and that's, a big reason why she's letting herself be abused. And that's just really not true, because domestic violence victims can be any education, they can be male, female, they can be any age. And so I was trying to figure out how I portray her as a real person without stereotyping her into that poor, abused victim role. And for me, it ended up really coming down to needing to lean into showing the reader how she got in that situation, and how even a few short years ago, she was completely devoted to her daughter, and she never would have believed that she would end up in this situation where she's choosing Larry over Fudd. And I think to make that feel believable and to make her feel believable, I had to lean into her love for her daughter and try to show that she does love her daughter, and she makes some really bad decisions, but she's really doing the best she can with the tools that she has to work with at the time.
Right. Yeah.
I absolutely love that statement of doing the best she can. That popped in my head over and over as I was writing my story too. So Lawrence has a granny who he feels a little disconnected from. She has a different set of rules. She's kind of strict. Some people would call her mean. She doesn't feel mean to me. She just feels like a Southern granny. And he's not connected to her at all. He thinks that she doesn't like him. And then he has his mother there, who at times she doesn't exactly step in and do maybe what he thinks she should do. And so that idea of they're just doing the best they can. I think throughout the story, I tried to round out who Ma is, where she comes from. She's also having some struggles of her own. She's raising these kids by herself. She's living with her mom, who is very different than she is. She's having some issues with her job. And so all of those things pair into who she is and that balance. And it also helps to be an adult writer, right? Because you get the idea of, I know what it's like to be a mom. I know what it's like to not make all great decisions, and balance that with the idea that even parents mess up. Sometimes they get it wrong. And I can relate to that as a parent too.
Yeah. And I really like how you had Lawrence kind of develop an understanding of his grandmother as it moves on. Like he doesn't like, she tends to make the same thing for dinner every day of the week. And he doesn't like some of the menu choices, but then he learns, well, she's got a fixed income and she's trying to feed herself and him and his sister and his mom and sometimes his cousins, and she's doing what she can afford. And he starts to go like, oh, and so I think that mutual understanding was cool. Okay, so there's a line in your book, Crystal, that I really loved, and I'm going to read it. It's near the end of the story, and Lawrence says, I remembered how much I wanted to be a normal family. I'd already figured out that normal wasn't real. Still, that didn't stop anyone from wanting it. And I just thought that was so true, because everybody has their own definition of normal, and you tend to think you're not, and you look at other people and you want to be this like elusive normal. So like, how did you come up with that line? I just thought it was perfect.
Thank you for that. I grew up with this constant desire to want normal, whatever that meant, right? I thought everyone else had it and I didn't. Mm-hmm. And so that was an emotion that I wanted to give Lawrence. He looked at everyone else and he thought, well, everyone has a normal house with 2 parents and some kids, and that's it. And they don't have to worry about this and that. And it was a constant emotion that I went through as a child, even probably as a young adult as well. And so I just wanted to put it in the story in a sense to say, like, normal isn't real. Your reality is yours. And I hope we get to have more conversations individually with our children and anyone who reads the book about what normal is. And if young people can get it really early, that no one's normal, the idea that a life has to be cookie cutter, it'll save them a lot of heartache. I wish someone had told me that when I was young. So it's something that I wanted to put in the book.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that. And I've got a quote from you too, Jessica, that I want to ask you about. You said this book is this book is at once a hug and a cry for help on behalf of those who haven't yet found their voices. And I've always felt like the right book in the hands of the right reader can be a hug. So how do you hope your book is going to help readers find their voices?
When I think about the difficult parts of childhood, I think for any kid, the hardest part is the feeling of the lack of control. You have so little say in so many of the big decisions in your life. And I think that's especially true for children in really hard situations. You feel alone, you feel isolated, you feel scared, you want to ask for help, but at the same time, it touches on that embarrassment that Chrystal talked about. You're also petrified that people are going to find out what's actually happening behind closed doors. And so I really hope that my book does a couple of things. That one, it helps kids who feel like they're alone, that they're living this not normal life. A lot of times they might feel like they're the only one. So I hope this book shows them that there are other people out there who have experienced these types of situations. They're not alone. And most importantly, I hope that it shows them that there is help available out there, and that it encourages them to, number one, ask for help, but also to really lean into their friendships and to the community members that can provide support out there.
And you put resources at the end of your book, which I thought was a really great idea. Places to direct people to who might need that kind of help. So that was wonderful. Okay, so I want to ask you, I think the final question is, obviously you hope your book's going to be read by as many people as possible, but if you could pick like the one ideal reader that you would want to hand your book to and say, here, please read this, who would each of your ideal readers be?
Go ahead, Chrystal.
I struggle with this because, oh my goodness. So if I have to only pick one, I would say I recently did a school visit, and I met a kid who was asking me all these questions. I did not know his background, but I later found out that he was very smart, but he often missed school because his home situation was a little difficult. He lived with his granny, and his parents weren't around. I learned that later, but when he walked up to me to ask me about the book, he asked me, well, why did you make him live with his granny? And I didn't know why he asked me that, but I tried to think of an answer that I thought would relate the story. And I also was kind of curious as to why he asked me that. Later, we found out his story, and the administrator at the school said, if there was one kid in the whole auditorium that we hoped would come up to you, it was him. So I think about him often. And so I would say a young person like him who maybe is struggling with their current living situation and is not feeling seen.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, I would really echo that answer. There's always a moment when I travel around doing school visits and I talk about my background and my path to becoming an author. And I try to connect with all the kids, but there's always a few kids in the audience that I can feel completely seen and heard for maybe the first time. And they're the kids that sit up and they're paying very close attention. And they're the ones who do come up to you afterward. And they're the ones that the teachers can't believe that they came up to you and wanted to talk to you more in person, and that they're behaving so respectfully when these are kids that are always acting out and getting in trouble. And so it's really that kid who, like Chrystal said, that really just doesn't feel heard and seen, really a 12-year-old Jessica.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you both. Before we go into Q&A, is there anything else we haven't talked about that you want to mention about your books or your writing?
The one thing I'll say about the book, we talk about heart and kind of heavy things. I will say that both books also involve some fun. I always like to say that the chess element in my book is interesting and fun. There's some music happening as well. So even though the books are full of heart and sometimes tough situations, there are also lots of fun and joy, and you'll definitely laugh with both books.
Oh, absolutely. They were both wonderful, compelling reads. They are not at all depressing or a downer. Especially like in Jessica's, there's the beauty pageant with the secondhand dress and how do you wear that evening gown when you have the tail of a coyote. And in your book, just I've never played chess, but the chess tournaments, and the relationship between Lawrence and Twyla, I thought was like hilarious, and I'm so glad you didn't have them date. Thank you. But they're both really delightful reads.
Well, thank you so much, Pat. I think I would love to share just a little tidbit about the future if I can, because I just this week got news that my title for my next book is locked in. So I would love to share that with everybody. I have a book coming out in the fall of 2024 that is a historical novel in verse. And it is also inspired by my childhood, but instead of centering on abuse and poverty, it really goes into socioeconomic differences, particularly around the discovery of the Titanic. And the title for the book is Unsinkable Cayenne. So I'm really excited about the title.
Ooh,
I love that.
Thank you.
So I guess Q&A are next, but I did want to just mention that again, Rhonda Romani was going to be here, but she wasn't able to. This is her book, Taking Freedom. It's about a boy who is in Syria right when the revolution starts. His parents send him to stay with his aunt, uncle, and cousin in the United States in hopes that he will be safe. And also he was starting to do things that made them worry. He wanted to get involved in the revolution, and they didn't think that was good for a young teen. He goes to the US, isn't happy to be there, meets his cousin who is connected to Syria, but also is living a very, American life. And they don't exactly get along at first, but then they discover they have a lot more in common than they thought. And it's a very wonderful, great story. I learned a lot more about Syria than I ever knew before. And so I would definitely recommend this one too. Mm-hmm. And I guess back to Alicia, right? And I think you're still on mute.
There we go. Thank you so much. I had seen some posts that I wasn't able to be heard earlier. Am I coming through a little bit here? Better?
It's a little bit better, yeah.
Okay, great. The technology evades me. So do we have any questions from anybody here? Please feel free to drop them down into the chat, and our authors would be very happy to answer your questions. While you guys are thinking of some questions for our wonderful authors, let me say to all of you personally, on a personal note, thank you all so much for making my job as a bookseller that much easier, that much richer. Thank you for writing books that are important with a capital I, because they change children's viewpoints in the best possible way. Children who have not seen themselves reflected can see themselves reflected. And you bring all of the emotion, but also the humor, the characters. As you said, you're not just writing, downers. You're not just trying to smack people in the face with the reality, but bringing the full roundness of the human experience as seen through a child's perspective, which is so frequently cast aside and not treated as something important, or children are just told to, look at the world as if it's sunshine and roses. And we all know that it's not for a lot of children. So I personally would like to say thank you so much for sharing so much of yourselves in such a beautiful way, and for making my job easier and richer and more fun and more heartfelt. I deeply appreciate all of you for that.
That was lovely. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any questions from anybody here?
I have a question for Chrystal. If nobody else has put their questions, you can just add your questions to the chat if there's anything you want to ask us about. But I am really curious, Chrystal, given that you are not a self-identified chess player, how and why did you decide to include chess in your story?
So many years ago, I watched a documentary. I love documentaries, and I watch them for all kind of random topics. And I watched a documentary about a chess grandmaster, and he talked about how chess changed his life as a young person, and how it gave him this power of deep thinking. And as he kind of rose in his and excelled in chess, he decided to bring that game back to his community and teach it to young kids. And so I kind of stored that in the back of my mind. I think writers do that all the time. We hear things and we go, that's interesting. And so when I thought about Lawrence and I thought about something that he could be good at, I thought about that power of deep thinking, the power of changing your circumstance by slowing down. And then it was just really, really fun to create all of these chess metaphors and then create the tournament and all that stuff in the book. I had no idea how popular chess is at like schools and chess clubs. So in a way, I think it kind of dropped in my mind just because I thought it would be a great metaphor. But it turns out that right now chess is popular. I guess I can thank Queen's Gambit or whatever. I don't know, but suddenly I feel like chess is popular. But that was kind of the general reason that I picked chess. So I practice at it, but like I said, I understand the theories and I did a ton of research for the book, but I'm still not very good.
I love it.
So I do have a question for you. I love that Fudd has a next door neighbor. I love that they're so close, right? I love that she can just walk across and have like this safe place, this place that she gets to just be herself. So how did you decide who to make her safe place?
That is an interesting question. I think I always knew, even though they were very isolated, that there was always going to be a neighbor of some sort. And it really wasn't until I sat down and I had fictionalized the story and I wrote that first scene where Fudd goes outside and she was sort of just sitting there. And I, as a writer, was like, okay, what happens next? And all of a sudden, the neighbor just waltzed onto the page. And it was like I didn't even have a choice. She came to me so fully formed. Lee is just this sparkling child who can't stop moving. And I do have a child in my life who is much the same way. So that was sort of an inspiration. But she's just one of those kids that's so bubbly and so full of life and couldn't stop moving. And I knew immediately that this was the perfect foil for Fudd, that it was sort of the safe spot that she needed in her life. And Lee just announced her appearance and wouldn't disappear. So I had to write her.
She absolutely did. I love it. I think it was just the perfect little escape. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions or anything that anybody would like to add to the conversation? Personal anecdotes?
I will share just one more little personal connection to this story that I think is kind of interesting. So I mentioned the rusted out boat that Fudd's mom's boyfriend brings home to fix up. That is based on actual events from my childhood when I was in maybe 4th or 5th grade. This giant rusted out boat turned up in our backyard, and the plan was to fix it up and sail down the Mississippi and live on this boat. And I was absolutely terrified by that idea. And I was sure it would just be a floating prison. And thankfully, no progress was ever made on that boat, and it is still a rusted out boat. But that was the idea for Fudd, that it made me realize, well, what if progress had been made on that boat? And what if that really was going to be a reality, and what would have happened? And so that was sort of the incentive that got the whole story rolling. And so I like that personal connection with the story.
We do have a question here from Linda, who would like to know, what was the most difficult scene, sorry if that's not the right word, for each of you to write, and why?
Oh, that's a really good question. Can I say the entire book?
That's valid. Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, that is tough. No, you go. I'm thinking.
Okay, I could probably come up with a reason why every scene in the book was the most difficult scene, but the thing that's coming to me right now is maybe the final scene, because originally when I wrote the book, there was this sort of cheesy fairy tale ending. I mean, like not the memoir, but the first time I wrote the fictional version, there was this fire and the boyfriend gets arrested and foster care gets involved and she lives in a safe family. And that really didn't feel realistic to me. And I didn't want to write a book that gave kids false hope. So coming up with something that felt like it gave kids hope, but still felt really true to life was really a challenge. And then making sure that showed up on the page in a way that resonated with readers was really tough. How about you, Crystal?
Yeah, I love the ending. I was just sitting here thinking about what I feel the same way for the story if it didn't end the way it did. So I'm happy that you arrived at a place with the ending. It's tough. I would say it's a very small moment. Pat alluded to it earlier, but so Lawrence is having a rough time and he's having all of these little tiny bad things happen in his life and he wants better control. And so he has a crush on a girl and he attempts to tell her and it does not go nearly the way that he hopes it goes. And it's kind of funny from an adult perspective, but I really hated to crush his hopes. I really wanted to give him something, but I realized that she could not be the win. I did not, and I also wanted to express in an example of a girl saying no and kind of having some agency and then him accepting her no. And so that was more important for me, but as the creator of the character, I wanted to give him a win earlier. And it's a simple thing, but I felt really bad that he lost again.
That can be really hard when we create these characters that we love so much. And our job as writers is literally to make their lives as difficult as possible. That's not always an easy thing to do.
Yeah, very true.
Oh, I'm sorry. We have a question from Cal. When naming characters, do you choose something that is symbolic or pick them out of a hat?
Jessica, you go first because your character's name is really cool.
Yeah, so Fudd is definitely a personal connection, another personal connection. I talk about this in the author's notes, but there was an adult in my life when I was young who insisted on calling me Fudd. And I don't know if it was from Elmer Fudd or where the name came from. All I remember is that I hated it so bad that I would cry and cry and cry. It would make me so sad. And then this person brought home a sweet little puppy. And I was so excited. I had always wanted a puppy. And I started dreaming up names for the puppy. And he decided the puppy's name was also going to be Fudd. And I was beyond crushed. And so that always stuck with me. And when I was thinking of names for my main character, I thought, why don't I rewrite the story? Why don't I give myself a happy story and sort of reclaim that word and that nickname for myself? And so I really wanted to nickname Fudd in the story, and I wanted her to be happy with that nickname, and I wanted her to own it. And so, yeah, I guess it was my own little bit of therapy, giving Fudd the nickname in the story.
I love it. I love the name. It's unique and original. So I'm happy you named her that. For me, Lawrence is just a very plain name. I did not have a lot of backstory into it. I will tell you that my editor at the publishing house tried to get me to change the name because it was kind of old-fashioned and it didn't really fit into like the copy or the marketing. But I insisted that it stay that way. He's living in a rural town in North Carolina. He does not need this really modern, cool name. And I thought Lawrence really fit his family and his situation. And so we stuck with Lawrence. But I will tell you that there were many discussions about giving him a more modern, hip name. And I just decided that wasn't it. So
Can I chime in on this one too?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm always looking, like when I do school visits or I'm out and about, I'm always looking at like the names of kids like over their locker or over their coat hook at elementary schools, or like if I'm in a grocery store, I'm checking out the cashier's name tags, and I'm always taking notes because names have changed so much you don't see any kids named Pat these days. It's just not a commonly used name anymore. And I'm always amazed at what I see in some of the creativity. And so I have like a list of names, and then it's a matter of like finding out what fits best with the particular project that I'm working on. So like naming characters is one of my all-time favorite things to do.
I really enjoy it too. And I hear sometimes that authors really agonize over names. I very rarely agonize over a name. Like I will have a sort of general idea of what feel I want the name to have, and then I'll see something and I'll just run with it. And very occasionally I will maybe make changes later, but it's not something I agonize about. I just really go for a feel that feels right for the character. And then that's the end of it.
Yeah, I like that feeling too. I really do. And so, Pat, my son is 8, and you can imagine the names that the kids in his class have. And I mean, it blows my mind. It's like you said, there are no crystals, right? There no one no one is going to be named Crystal. So I often just like go through his class list, and I'm always amazed at the names. So yeah.
Well, this
Same.
book I have coming out next fall is set in 1985, so that's considered now a historical novel.
Isn't
and
that sad?
That is so
that's a whole
disrespectful.
different discussion, right? Like that's very depressing, I realize, but it's true. It's a historical novel. And so going back through and really trying to identify the 80s names versus the names that, we see kids getting now is also a little bit mind-blowing.
And you can go, there's the Social Security website. You can sort by year and it will tell you what names were most popular for babies born in that particular year. And you can even break it down by state. So if you want to know what kids in Kansas were named, in 1956, you can go find it out. And I mean, I've played around on that site and had a lot of fun.
That sounds
I did not
fun.
know that. Thank you, Pat, for sharing.
I have one final question. We have a couple minutes left, and this might be an eye roller of a question, but it's always something that I love to ask authors because I find it fascinating. And this is for all of you. And there's an alternate, and that is, what is your favorite book, or what? Because I know that's so hard, and I can usually just give like, well, here's my top 5, but or what is your favorite book right now? Either one.
I can do right now.
Yeah, I'd love to know.
I mean, I read like a ton of picture books. I mean, that's my thing.
Sure.
The World's Best Class Plants by Liz Garten Scanlon and Audrey Vernick, illustrated by Lenore Bontiago. It's just delightful. It's about this classroom of kids at a school who are all feeling, bummed out because the classroom next door has a pet iguana and this other classroom has a guinea pig and they have a plant. And so they're bummed out, and the teacher says, this plant is plenty exciting for all of us. And then one kid goes, well, we should at least name it. And so, they decide the plant's name is Jerry. And once Jerry has a name, like the class just like falls in love with Jerry and wants to make sure Jerry is fed and watered and gets enough sun, and Jerry flourishes. And suddenly the whole school wishes they had a Jerry. It's the whole thing about once you care about something, it's more important to you than it was before. It's beautifully done. It's hilariously funny. It's got a great twist at the end. The World's Best Class Plant.
That
Amazing.
sounds fantastic.
Yes.
I am putting a link to that book in the chat right now,
Awesome.
in case anybody would like to check it out, because I know I will.
Okay, I can't possibly identify my all-time favorite book, but I will say
okay.
now, I am obsessed with novels in verse, since that's what I'm working on, and particularly with Megan E. Freeman's novel in verse, Alone, which is the story of a girl who lies to her parents, and she goes and stays the night at her grandparents' house, who isn't there, but there's an emergency evacuation, and she ends up being left completely alone in this city for years, and she has to figure out how to survive all on her own. It's written in verse. It's brilliant. It's page turning. It's the kind of story that you cannot put down. And even I have a reluctant reader at home, and she pretty much read it in one sitting. It's that gripping. So Alone by Megan E. Freeman is well worth checking out.
It's a good book.
We
Yeah,
do have
great.
that in the store right now, and I just put that in the chat, and I'm also writing it down for all of these I'm writing down for myself. So thank you.
Awesome. I'm trying to think.
You,
So
Crystal?
finding one, it's a tough thing. I will tell you one that I'm looking forward to that's coming out. It's a sequel. It is called You Owe Me One Universe. It's
Yes.
by Chad Lucas. It is the sequel to Thanks a Lot Universe. It's beautiful. It's contemporary fiction. I'm so looking forward to the sequel. I have not read it yet, and I'm trying to decide if I'm going to read it before it comes out or just wait. But either way, the first one was beautiful. One of my favorite expressions of all of the things. It does a lot of stuff, and so done so well. There also is a curly haired Ezra in the book, and I also have a son who is curly haired, and his name's Ezra, and so it just fits me in my life perfect. But the sequel to that book is coming out, and I'm super excited about it. So that's another one that I think I should mention.
I'm going to second that. And I also want to say, I feel like Chad is a Canadian Crystal in the sense that he's one of those writers that just, his characters feel so realistic that once you start reading, you just feel like you know these kids and you're right there in the story with them. So I'm really excited for that book too.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to our authors. Pat, thank you so much for your wonderful questions. And thank all of you for your work, for coming to hang out with us tonight. Congratulations on all the new books. Jessica, in particular, our closest neighbor. Can't wait to see you tomorrow. Jessica will be coming and signing all of her books so that we can get those shipped out to literally all over the country. We've been getting orders. And we appreciate everybody being here. Have a wonderful evening and keep reading and keep writing. And thank you so much. And thank you,
Thanks
everybody.
for having us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.